Okay, welcome guys. Thank you so much for joining. I want to welcome Seth to our group over here. It's fantastic. We are talking about life and death. As a recap, the first session we discussed how the Torah wants us to live. No mitzvah should come at the expense of your life, with the exception of three. We discussed those three: murder, adultery, idolatry, idol worship. Person is obligated to give up their life for those three, and we discussed the source. Then last session we discussed how the Torah demands that when there is a murder, when somebody dies in an act, you have to make sure that the guy was guilty of murder. It's possible that the guy died of a heart attack. So if I drop a feather on a person and the guy drops dead, it's possible he died from the feather, and this is the world's biggest Guinness Book weakling on the planet. That's possible. But rather, you should take the more likely scenario, innocent until proven guilty, and it has to be that there was enough force in the act to kill somebody, and that the instrument, the vehicle of the murder, also was large enough or was big enough to cause the murder. We saw that from the Torah itself. The Torah says that if somebody died from a stone or from a piece of wood, and by stone and piece of wood, the Torah says the size of a hand, and there was enough to kill. So in that case, you have the right to say somebody threw it at someone and they dropped dead. If it was the proper size, you have the right to say the guy committed a murder. But otherwise, you don't have the right to say that. And the Talmud said, this is what we concluded with last week. The Talmud said that if it's metal, metal is another story, or iron, it said, is another story. And we see that from the Chumash. The Chumash, by iron only, the Chumash does not give a measurement. And the Talmud says we can derive from here that iron is able to kill even in the smallest amount, and you don't need a measurement. So we're not talking about where I throw a piece of iron on somebody and then they die 3 years later. Where I hit somebody with iron and they die immediately, you have the right to assume the iron killed them. Now, what do we mean over here by that iron doesn't need a measurement? So the Talmud says we're talking about where the iron pierced. You pierce a guy. We had a debate on how to understand that between Rashi and Tosafot. So far, Seth, I'm just reviewing for another moment. We had a debate what that means that you have the right to assume that iron kills by piercing. According to Rashi, Rashi said that means if somebody gets pierced in the heart or in the windpipe, or actually I think Rashi might have said the food pipe, the esophagus. So if a guy gets pierced in certain areas of their body, you could die from that. So you have the right to assume it was the murderer who did that. And Tosafot does not disagree with that law. Tosafot said, yeah, of course that's true, but that wouldn't be unique to iron. That would be anything you pierce a guy, you stab them in the heart, even with a piece of wood, you would also assume they're a murderer. And therefore Tosafot says the uniqueness of iron is that it infects. It causes infection. So if a guy dies from infection, you have the right to assume that it was the murderer who did that. Done. That was last week. Okay, now we go to this week's topic. And as I mentioned in the email, this week we're going to get into direct versus indirect. So we always prove things from extremes. That's a big, big, important rule in debate and philosophy. If you want to prove something to somebody, take the most extreme case. And if they say, well, that's extreme, yeah, but the validity of it still stands. The only reason you don't like it is emotional because it's so extreme. So let's take an extreme case. An extreme case is that Johnny's in 3rd grade. I said this last week. And Johnny's math teacher insults Johnny because Johnny put the decimal in the wrong place. And because of that, Johnny got depressed. And because Johnny got depressed, he is a little slower in his walk. You know how when people are depressed, they walk slowly and they trudge along and they don't have a boost and an excitement in their step. And so 40 years later, Johnny was crossing a railroad track and the train was coming, but he estimated he had enough time to cross. But because Johnny was a little slow, he didn't have enough time, and Johnny ended up getting crushed, and his body could be found in 8 different zip codes. Now, would you say that his math teacher 40 years before, because she insulted him and she made him depressed for a moment, that she had something to do with this? The answer is, it's possible. Hey, anything's possible. But only Hashem would know such a thing. Only Hashem could know such a thing. The human court can absolutely not assess that. In order for the human court to make somebody guilty or to penalize somebody, that has to be assessable. Has to be that they can assess it. The human court has no way to judge indirect damages. Oh, this guy's math teacher insulted him 40 years ago, and so he didn't walk with a energy and didn't get out of the way of the train. Maybe, maybe not. But who can judge such a thing? Who will be able to judge such a thing? God. Hashem could judge such a thing, right? And so there's the divine court system where Hashem, at the end of a person's life, yeah, you made fun of somebody and you bullied somebody, and because of that, the person ended up not getting a job because they lost self-esteem. Guess what? Every last thing like that, it is in Hashem's court. Every last thing. But the earthly court does not demand punishment for something called grama. Grama means indirect. Now, does that mean it's permissible to indirectly kill somebody? So, let's say that I set off a chain reaction. I set off a chain reaction in which I throw a pebble and the pebble hits a seesaw, and the seesaw throw, like you see in the cartoons, and the seesaw throws something else up, and this causes that, which causes that, which causes that, and then the guy dies at the end. So let's just say that would be called an indirect damage. Let's just say that for a second. So is it permissible for me to do that? And I'm trying to kill the guy? Of course not. So there's 3 things you need to know about grama before we start the Talmud. And I'm going to show you a source for each of them in the Chumash. There are 3 things you need to know about grama. Grama means indirect damage and indirect murder. The 3 things you need to know are, number 1, it's forbidden. Absolutely can't hurt somebody indirectly, nor can you kill somebody indirectly. Forbidden. That's number 1. It's forbidden. I will prove it to you soon. Number 2 is that even though it's forbidden, the earthly court doesn't demand punishment for it. That's number 2. An earthly court does not demand punishment for it. And item number 3 is Hashem will demand punishment for it. Now, how do I know those 3 things? Of course, Hashem will only demand punishment for it if you really intended to hurt the person. Okay. How do I know those 3 things are true? So first of all, how do I know grama, indirect damaging somebody, is forbidden in the first place? How do I know it's forbidden? So I'm going to show you a famous pasuk in the Chumash. All right. I'm sure you've heard of this pasuk before, probably, maybe. It says, in pasuk 14, we're going to look at the Hebrew, Lo tichalel cheresh, don't curse the deaf person. Let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the next part of the pasuk. V'lifnei iver lo titain michshol. Don't place a stumbling block. Don't put a block in front of the blind man. Even though the blind man has no idea what you put there, v'yareita me'elohecha, you should fear God. Ani Hashem, I am God. Now, what does that mean? What do you think that means, Seth? What is the Torah saying? Don't put a block in front of a blind man. Forget about deeper ideas. What's the simple meaning of that pasuk?
Like, don't hurt or try to hurt someone that that can't protect themselves.
Perfect. Great. Now, was that a direct damage? Meaning, did I throw a rock at the guy and cause them to break their arm? Was it direct or indirect? I simply saw their path. They're walking to 7-Eleven to get a Slurpee. So halfway between their house and 7-Eleven, I put a rock. Is that direct or indirect?
Indirect.
Indirect. I didn't directly damage them. And still the Torah says you're not allowed to do it. Now, our sages tell us, and Rashi, I believe, brings this on Chumash, that there's a much deeper meaning over here in this verse. The broader understanding of this verse is, don't cause somebody to stumble when, like Seth said, when they can't help themselves. Don't cause somebody to stumble. And the broader application of that is, somebody comes up to you for directions and says, hey, I'm trying to get to this building to get to a wedding, and you know exactly where it is. And instead you tell them, take a left, and really it's a right. Now, you just had fun at their expense. Very funny. But they don't know better. You're taking advantage of somebody who cannot help themselves. So that is included in don't place a stumbling block in front of the blind. Also, giving somebody bad advice purposefully. We all give bad advice not purposefully. You do your best. But let's say purposefully you give a guy bad advice. That means they're blind as far as this decision is made. And you are not blind because you know what to do. Let's say you're really adept when it comes to stocks. And you tell somebody, oh, invest in this, and you know it's a bad decision for them. So that is a application of the verse, don't place a stumbling block in front of the blind. So let's see Rashi over here in Chumash. Don't place a stumbling block in front of a blind. Before a person who is blind regarding a matter, that means even if they're not literally blind, of course if they're literally blind, but even if they're not literally blind, they're only blind concerning one matter, you shall not give advice that is improper for him. For instance, do not say to someone, sell your field, buy a donkey with the proceeds, while in truth you plan to cheat him, since you yourself will take it from him by lending him money and taking the donkey as collateral. So let's say you tell somebody, right, I want you to sell your field, and you have intention that you want that field. Whose interest are you acting in? Are you acting in the guy's interest, or you're acting in your interest?
Your interest.
You're acting your own interest. So that's a prohibition of don't place a block in front of stumbling block in front of the blind. Now, everything I just said is all true, but it's not the most famous application of this mitzvah. The most famous application of this mitzvah is you may not cause somebody else to sin. You may not cause somebody else to sin. So let's say somebody is a kosher observer, and I switch their sandwich with a pork sandwich, and they don't know the difference, so they didn't see you there. So you've caused them to sin. You're placing a stumbling block in front of the blind because they're blind in this matter. They don't know. Or you cause somebody to speak gossip by goading them on. All of those are the most famous applications of this verse. In any case, we see from the Chumash over here, we see from the Torah that indirect damage is forbidden. You're hurting somebody, whether you hurt their body by causing a real stumbling block, or you hurt their soul by causing them to sin. Indirect damage is just as forbidden as direct damage. Okay, so I just proved 1/3 of the equation. I proved that it's forbidden. How do I know that Hashem is going to be upset at it and Hashem is going to deal with it? Well, if we go just a few verses later, it says, the most perhaps famous pasuk in the Torah, look at pasuk 18. Don't take revenge against somebody. Don't bear a grudge against somebody. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So we have a positive mitzvah, which is defined in the Talmud to treat others as you would want yourself treated. And therefore, if somebody violates any mitzvah, that goes to the heavenly court. Specifically, when it comes to positive mitzvot, things that you should do, there's no punishment for them in earthly courts for positive mitzvot, like say the Shema. If you didn't say the Shema, the earthly court doesn't do anything about that. But that all goes into Hashem's realm. So if you, by placing a stumbling block, not only is it very specifically prohibited in the Torah, it's a lack of loving your neighbor as yourself, and therefore it goes to Hashem's court. Now, there's one more third I have to prove. The last third that I have to prove is, how do I know that the earthly court does not get involved in indirect damage? How do I know that from? So I know that from a different pasuk. It says, over here, it's talking about damaging, and specifically this pasuk is talking about where you damage somebody else's property. Where you damage somebody else's property. So it says, "Umaki behema yishalmena." If I go and I hit your animal, meaning I kill your animal by hitting it. So your animal is like your property. Your cow is your property. It's part of your farm. It's how you make your milk, or you're raising it for meat, or whatever it is you're raising the cow for. If I hit your property, then yishalmena, you have to pay. You have to pay. Now today, that's very basic in Western society. If you damage somebody's property, you have to pay. But it was not always like that. That was adopted because of the Torah. So the Torah says over here, the only time the court makes you pay is something they can assess when you directly damage it. So if I directly kill your cow, the cow was worth $400, you pay $400. But if it was indirect, the Torah never makes payment for that. So the Torah only makes payment for direct. So I just said three things about grama. Number one, it's forbidden. Hashem will see it. Just like don't place a stumbling block in front of the blind. It's completely indirect. You can't do it. But nonetheless, the earthly courts don't get involved. Okay, great. Now last week in the Mishnah, we saw that the Mishnah differentiated as far as whether I'm a murderer between direct and indirect. How do I see the Mishnah did that? Because of the case of the following. So I'm just going to review a draught. We said not only are you a murderer if you hit somebody with a stone or if you hit somebody with an iron, etc. You're also a murderer if you throw somebody into a pool, or if you throw somebody into a fire and they did not have enough time to get out. So let's just see that in the Mishnah again. Where am I exactly? Right here. Here. If somebody pushed someone into water or into fire so that the person, skip that one. Let's do it in the Hebrew. One second. Where is it? Here it is. Kavash alav l'toch hamayim. If you throw somebody into the water, or l'toch or into fire, ve'eino yachol la'alot misham, and they cannot get out of there in time because they're going to die. Chayav, you're guilty. Now that is called direct murder. That is called direct murder. Later on in the Talmud, Rashi is going to define for us what is the cutoff between direct and indirect, but that's called direct. If I throw somebody into a pool, they do not have enough time to get out. So why? Because v'kavash alav l'toch hamayim. I'm holding his head down. Kavash means I'm holding him down in the water. That is called you're a murderer, or I'm holding somebody into a fire. I don't let them get out. I lock the door, whatever it is. That's direct. However, the Mishnah said afterwards, dachfol l'toch hamayim l'toch ha'or. If I throw somebody into a pool or into a fire and they could get out, I don't hold them down. Now in that case, patur. Patur means you're exempt. Does that mean, just because it says you're exempt, does that mean you did not sin? Is that what that means? God forbid, you're absolutely a murderer in Hashem's eyes. If you intended to murder the guy, you're a murderer in Hashem's eyes. But the court can't deal with it because ultimately, it was indirect because the actual guy who caused his own murder was the guy himself by not coming out of the fire. So you could say, well, he was lazy. Right. Then that's like the case I said before of the train tracks. You know, the train tracks, the guy was being slow, but you can't blame that on your third grade teacher. If you had time to get off and you didn't take it, everyone else is not a murderer. They're not a good person, and Hashem will deal with them.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
if you say you know that a person is lazy and you know that a person won't want to swim out if you throw them in the water, and then you throw them in the water, is that like putting a rock in front of a blind man because you know that they have this disadvantage and they won't come out, and you still throw them in the water?
It's probably a lot worse than that. It's actually murder in Hashem's eyes. But if the guy, the difference between direct over here and indirect is, does the guy have the free will to get out? If the person's being lazy, that's going to be called indirect. If the person's choosing to be lazy, that's indirect. If the person has no choice, let's say I throw somebody into a fire and I don't hold them down, but let's say they physically just don't have the strength to get up, and you know that, then that would be called direct, because the guy has no chance to get out. The Mishnah is clear. If the guy has the ability, it all depends on if he has the ability or not. Okay? All right. Good. Now, again, I said Rashi later on is going to define the difference between direct and indirect. Let me pause here and ask you guys a question. Let me pause here and ask you a question. How come in the case, the Mishnah said, where I put somebody into a fire and I hold them down, or I put them in the water and I hold them down, that's called direct murder. But ultimately, it's not me murdering them, right? It's the water murdering them. How would you explain why that's called direct? It's not me, it's the water. Do you know why water kills somebody, by the way? Why is it that when somebody drowns, they die? What's the biology behind it?
Their lungs fill with water and they can't breathe.
That's exactly right. And that's called, in English, that's called suffocation.
Yeah.
So ultimately, you're suffocating the guy. That's exactly right. So why is that called direct? Like I directly murdered him.
Because you're forcefully putting something into his body. You're forcefully not allowing air into his body. It's kind of like stabbing someone in the trachea. Because if you stab someone in the trachea, they can't.
Good. Okay. Here's what I think Ben is saying. If you would consider that indirect, when I throw someone into a pool and I hold them down, if you would call that indirect, then you'll never have direct murder. Let's say I shoot somebody with a gun, God forbid. Well, it's not me, it's the bullet. And you know what the bullet did? All the bullet caused is that the guy's not getting circulation from their heart anymore. So isn't that indirect? So Rashi's going to say later on, whenever the murderer is there right now, that's called direct murder. Whereas in the case where the guy had 5 minutes to get out and he didn't get out, the actual murderer is not there now. It happens 5 minutes later. That's going to be Rashi's, that's just a sneak preview of what Rashi's going to say later on. And we're going to have all types of cases, and we're going to have to show ourselves why each case fits into the law. But that's the bottom line criterion to remember. Is the murderer there right now? So if I shoot somebody with a bullet, technically, well, the bullet first hits the guy's artery, and then the artery can't pump the blood anymore. And then the guy's not getting circulation from their heart anymore, and they're not getting oxygen. It's true, there's 20 steps. But right now, the cause of murder is there this moment. Same thing when I throw somebody into a water that they can't get out of, the murderer is there right now. That's excellent, Ben. As opposed to when they had 5 minutes to get out and they choose to not get out, the murderer is not there right now. The murderer only first comes 5 minutes later. You could go underwater for a few seconds if you want. Nobody's going to say that you're murdering yourself because you plan to get out. The murderer means where definite murder is in front of you. And if you shoot somebody, definite murder is in front of you. Good? All right. I'm skipping the first line of the Talmud we saw last week. Okay. Now, the Talmud is going to ask a question. Is everyone good till here? Yeah? Okay. The Talmud is going to ask a question. In order to understand this Talmud's question, you need to know the following premise. The Mishnah does not use extra words, nor does it write extra cases. Everything is extremely concise. And so if you could figure something else out on your own, and the Mishnah goes out of its way to say it, it's got to be there's something I wouldn't have known that it's teaching me. And part of the reason for that is, as I'm sure you guys have learned before, all about the oral law, the Mishnah was never meant to be written down. Did you guys learn that before? Okay. The Mishnah was not supposed to be written down. Hashem passed down a body of law at Sinai. It was passed down orally. And it complements the written Chumash. Everything is based on the written Chumash, but it's the oral explanations. And the only reason it had to be written down eventually in the days of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is what? Does anyone know the answer? Why did it have to be written down eventually? Seth, go for it.
We were all in the diaspora, so we were all separated. And then we were like assimilating, I guess, or like we could have assimilated if we didn't know like all the laws. So we wrote down the oral Torah so we could have it like written.
Excellent. And we're missing one step. The step you're missing is because of the Roman persecution and all that, and what you're saying, people were forgetting. That's the step we're missing. People were forgetting it. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi quotes a verse, Eis lasot l'Hashem heifer Torah. There's a time to act for God and to breach his Torah. He breached the Torah by writing it down, but he said otherwise people are forgetting it. So he wrote it down. So because of that, partially because of that, it's extremely concise. It doesn't use extra words. Everything's supposed to be oral. And therefore, the Talmud is going to ask the following question. If we go back to the Mishnah, I don't particularly like this website we're using because it doesn't really have the regular format of a Talmud, but it's the best I can get right now. So there were two cases of throwing somebody into the sea. Case one is where you don't give them time to get out. Okay? Remember that. That's case one, where you don't give them time to get out. Let's read it. Kavash alav l'toch hamayim, if he held him in the water, or into the fire, and the victim could not extricate himself from there and he died, the murderer is liable to be executed. Now, Jacob Tzvi, without knowing anything else but just that line, can you prove to me what would be the case if the guy did have time to get out?
Well, did the guy who like pushed him into the water or into the fire, did he want him to get out, or did he want him
he
to
wanted
die?
to kill him. Let's say I wanted to kill him, but the guy had time. If the guy had time to get out, prove to me from that last line that I just read what the law would be. Again, it says if you push somebody underwater, you hold them underwater, or you push them into a fire and they can't get out, you are guilty as a murderer.
Well,
What inference can I make from there without knowing anything else? What would be the law if they did have time to get out?
attempted murder.
Would you be guilty as a murderer or not?
Yeah.
I say no. You know why I say no?
Why?
Because it says clearly, Eina yachol la'alot, they couldn't get out. The only time you're a murderer is if they couldn't get out. So what's the inference from there? Inference means what can we derive out of there? If they did have time to get out, it's indirect. It's called grama, as we discussed, and you're not a murderer. That would be the inference from there.
He still tried though. Like,
okay, hold on the why. Hold on the why for a minute. But the inference from there is clear.
Indirect.
That if the guy had time, he wouldn't be a murderer, right? Everyone clear on that? Then the Mishnah goes on and tells me, by the way, if you push somebody into water or into fire and they could get out, and you could get out, patur, you're exempt. You're exempt from murder. Well, I knew that already. You don't have to spell that out for me. It's like saying, I tell you the following. If you want to come to the assembly, you may not be wearing shorts. Okay, stop right there. Now, what happens if you're wearing shorts? You can't come to the assembly, obviously. So I don't have to go and say, and by the way, if you're wearing shorts, you can't come to the assembly. I would have known that already from the inference. So that's the Talmud, what the Talmud's question is going to be. Why do you have to both spell out, if he can't get out, you're a murderer. And by the way, if he could get out, you're not a murderer. I know if you say he can't get out, you're a murderer, that if he could get out, you're not a murderer. That's going to be the Talmud's question. Is it clear? Because the Mishnah doesn't use extra words, doesn't use extra cases. Everything is as concise as possible. And so therefore, if the Mishnah goes ahead and says that extra case, there must be good reason for it. It must be there to teach me something. So let's read what the Talmud says, and then Jacob will go back to your question. I don't want to confuse things. Is that okay? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okie doke. So the Talmud says the following. The Mishnah teaches, Resha means in the earlier case in the Mishnah it says, if he held him in the water and the person died, the murderer is liable. He's guilty as a murderer. Now the first clause of the Mishnah, okay, hold on. So therefore it goes without saying that if he couldn't get out, if he could get out, then you're not a murderer. So why do you need to teach me this? Both cases. So the Talmud's going to say there is what's called a chidush. Chidush means something new I wouldn't have known by telling me both cases. Now listen carefully to this. Reisha, the first case in the Mishnah, which says that if you held the guy down, you're a murderer. Rabuta ka mashmalan. Rabuta means, it comes from the word rav, which means big. It's coming to teach me something bigger, something new. What is it coming to teach me? And see for rabuta ka mashmalan. And the latter case is also coming to teach me something new. Reita rabuta ka mashmalan. The first case is coming to teach me what's the first case, guys? What's the first case? Remind me?
If you hold him in the water and he dies.
Good, excellent. Afalgav delav ihu dachfo. Even if you're not the same person who pushed him in. So, Ben, I hope you forgive me for using you in this example, but Ben pushes Johnny into the pool. It wasn't Jacob Tzvi. And then Jacob sees him and he wants to play a practical joke, so Jacob puts his hand on the guy's head. The guy doesn't get out. He dies. Who's the murderer? Who's the murderer here? When Ben pushed him in, he had time to get out. He had 5 minutes. He could have gotten out. Jacob comes and he puts his hand on the guy's head. Who's the murderer?
I am Jacob.
Jacob is the murderer. That's right. So it's teaching me, Alfagav delav ihu dachbo, even though he's not the one who pushed him in, kiven de ein yachol alot, since he's the cause that the guy can't get out, misham, from there, mate, and he dies, chayav, you are guilty, meaning the one who held him down is guilty of the murder. That's why the Mishnah says, if we go back to the words of the Mishnah, the Mishnah said, right, he held him in the water. Who's the guilty one? The one who holds him down. Of course, if the one who holds him down is the same one who pushed him in, of course. But even if it's not the same one who pushed him in, it's the one who held him down who's the murderer. Because until that happened, the guy had time to get out. And the first guy was just an indirect. Go for it, Seth.
So with your example for like the fire, if I pushed someone into a fire, but I knew he could get out, and someone else came in and locked all the doors, the murderer would be the person who locked the doors?
100%.
Okay.
100%. Now, there's something I have to tell you about what Ben just asked me, but I don't want to confuse things. Ben, remind me to talk about damages in a moment, okay, when I'm done. Now let's go to the second case. What's the great teaching it's telling me in the second case? Da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. Okay. And Seifa, the latter case, which said what? What was the latter case? Remind me the latter case?
Was that if you push someone in the water, but he was out, like you're not the murderer?
And they had time to get out, right? In that case, it's teaching me, afalgav, even though the dachfo, even if it was the same guy who pushed him in, kiven de yachol alot misham u'meit patur. That means even though he pushed the individual into water, meaning even though I pushed the individual into water, and I didn't hold him in long enough that he had to die. He had enough time, even if it's all me and there's nobody else involved. It's all me, I'm exempt. Okay? So the guy who pushed him in is exempt in that case. That's what it's teaching me. So the great chidush, what it's teaching me in the first case, is even if I'm not the pusher, but I cause his death by holding him down, the latter person is guilty. And the last case is teaching me when it says he had time to get out, even if I pushed him, and let's say I held him down for 5 seconds, but the guy had enough time, if I was the only one involved, I'm still exempt. Now, to go back to what Ben asked before, Ben said, so what if you lock all the doors, etc.? So let me make something clear over here. Let me make something clear. If I push somebody into the fire, and let's say I don't hold him down, all right? And let's say the guy gets out. The guy gets out. Just because he had time to get out, and the guy did get out, we're just talking about murder over here. We're not talking about damages. There's an entire book of Talmud which deals with the laws of damages. The guy comes out, his clothes are burnt, his head is all burnt, he has to go for trauma and burn situations, and he loses his job. There are 5 damage payments the Torah demands. Okay? Nezek means damage. I'm not going into how you evaluate damage. Tsar, pain. I'm not going into how we evaluate that. Repoi, doctor bill. Shevet, unemployment that you cause. And boshet, embarrassment. we're not discussing any of that now. We're discussing murder. If I throw someone into a fire and he has 20 minutes to get out and he gets out, good, I'm not a murderer. I'm absolutely going to pay for all the damages. And if I intended to murder him, I promise you Hashem will deal with it. I promise you that. Okay? Because only Hashem knows what's going on in your mind. Only Hashem can evaluate such things to assess them. Okay, now let's go back to Jacob Tzvi's question, and then we'll call it a day. Jacob.
Yeah.
He forgot his question.
Wasn't it like
I don't know what your question was. Go ahead. You didn't ask.
I think it was if you accidentally push somebody into the pool, right? Was it that?
Whoa, that's your question? If you accidentally push somebody into a pool?
No, so my question is, if you're just walking and then if you like accidentally trip and you push a guy into a fire and if he dies, then
right.
What would happen to you? Like, would that be your
when
fault?
something is an accident, the Torah does not hold you liable for anything. And the source of that is the law of rape. If a married woman is raped, God forbid, and we actually looked at this verse the first session, God forbid, so she's technically doing an act of adultery. It's technically an act of adultery. The Torah says, "V'lanara lo ta'aseh davar." Don't do anything to the woman. The man will get the death penalty. Don't do anything to the woman, because she has no chet mishpat mavet. She's not guilty of anything because it wasn't her fault at all. So when something's accidental, it's not your fault. Now there's a difference between accidental, that's called ones in Hebrew, versus something called shogeg. Shogeg is I had a lapse in judgment in my mind. Like for example, I forgot today's Shabbat and I violated Shabbat. That wasn't an accident. That was carelessness. That's another case. But you asked me about an accident. Accident, the Torah says, is as if you didn't do it in the first place. Okay? All right, guys, you did a great job. I know it's finals this week, and you took the time to come out anyway. So I want to compliment you on that. And you guys are interested in going further in the summer, right? I mean, if you can't make a week, you can't make a week.
Yeah.
But other than that, fantastic. Okay, I wish you guys an amazing day, and I wish you a lot of success on your finals.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi.
All right. Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you.
See you next week. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.